Hey, folks, it is February the 11th, and today we're going to continue on with a short lecture on the Cold War. And so we're in the middle of two different things. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Civil Rights Movement again, which is appropriate considering it's like History Month. But also we're going to talk about the next president to come up in our timeline, John F. Kennedy. And so please keep in mind, it's a very good idea for you to go through that study material I posted on Google Classroom. But also, everyone in the class except one person has an account with Study Island, and that person knows who that person is. And so everybody else, you had an assignment that was due on Tuesday. I need you to go back and do that. The reason is not only is it a grade, but it's another format for you to learn the material, but also it helps me, the teacher, be able to go in and see what we're weak on and what we're strong on. So I can go back and kind of like tutor over it later, right? And review. I have a new one that I've assigned. It's due in a week. And so I'm just moving along from one section to another. They're just 20 questions. Make sure you do the reading. The reading has the answers. And all that good stuff. So yeah, I mean, we have an EOC this year. It hasn't been called off. We still have to do it. So you got to get ready for that test. The EOC for U.S. History.
Oh,
so, yeah. Hey, all right, kids. So last time when we left off, we were talking about the Little Rock Nine. Remember those high school students who weren't allowed to go to what was a white-only high school. However, the president at the time, President Eisenhower, is going to use the U.S. Army to help these students be protected as they attend class. And so the Civil Rights Movement, it's one of those things that you're going to find all three branches of the federal government is going to have to flex its authority and power to help it along. So what do you think happened here?
Maybe
tornado.
Maybe something like a terrorist attack, like maybe from the neighbors or something.
It was a bomb. Yeah, this was Martin Luther King Jr.'s house.
Yeah, like they were like they told him that they're like your house.
Yeah, their house, their church was bombed.
Everything like pretty much he owned is like love.
I don't know.
Like I think one of his did his brother die?
Well, no, his family was home, his wife and his children, but nobody was hurt. Luckily, it was dynamite, and dynamite can cause pretty bad explosion.
Yes.
But the cool thing is like since it wasn't like put inside of anything that would have caused shrapnel or anything, it looks like it just destroyed the front porch. Yeah, he wasn't even home during the time.
It looks like that.
Yeah, it looks pretty bad.
I can't find the note.
Look at the car.
Oh, it's down there. It's down there under Cold War notes. Okay, but back then you could buy dynamite all the time because a lot of people used it for like farming to like remove tree stumps, to help build ponds and stuff like that, or to drain certain areas for so for farmland or livestock. So you used to be able to get it really easy. It's a pretty restricted, controlled substance these days, though. But yeah, so we see acts of terrorism. That's what a terrorist act is: using violence to try to control somebody's politics or beliefs, and that's what happened here. So changes in America, civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. preached for a Christian alternative to gaining civil rights for African Americans, using nonviolent civil disobedience. And so, and it's going to be very effective. And there's a lot of movements you're going to find throughout history that can use nonviolent civil disobedience to really change policy. For example, like when the Christians were in Rome, they used nonviolent civil disobedience to finally gain acceptance in Rome. If you move on to like the freedom of India from the British Empire, You're going to find Gandhi is going to use nonviolent civil disobedience in order for the British to finally give it up. For a long time, it was attempted in order to end slavery in the United States. Unfortunately, it took a civil war to get rid of the legal forms of it. Though many do still argue today that you can find forms of slavery in America and throughout the world that you often find in, like, say, human migration, like a lot of the abuses that go on with that, and of course, sweatshops and slave factories and things in some parts of the world. So, as many blacks and whites marched and participated in what's known as sit-ins. So, a sit-in is like this: you have a restaurant that says only white people can eat here, and so what you do is you would have these African Americans, usually young college or high school age ones, would go sit down at the restaurant and refuse to move until they were given service. And so they're not doing anything violent, not harming anybody, but they're being disobedient civilly against the rules of the law. And so also conduct boycotts. So not buy certain products because they're linked to racism or something. But they would also face police brutality and mob violence during their marching or during the sit-ins. You might have people get beat up. So kind of like we talked with Little Rock Nine. These kids were trying to go to school, but you would have angry mobs outside the school threatening their lives, cursing at them, throwing things at them, and trying to block their entry. Though the Supreme Court ruled in favor of ending segregation of buses, Martin Luther King Jr.'s home was bombed while his family was inside. Fortunately, like we said earlier, they were uninjured. America was divided on the issue of civil rights. Y'all okay?
Yeah.
Okay. But Ike, that's President Eisenhower's actions in protecting school children, the Supreme Court's rulings, and the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So that's something from the Supreme Court, the President, and Congress. All three branches of the federal government working in tandem for civil rights signaled that the federal government was ready to change the country. But you can see that there was a lot of resistance against it. And like I mentioned last time, desegregation of schools is going to be faster in some areas and slower than others. As the movement carried on, Eisenhower's second term was ending, however. So he's president during the beginning of this, and he's showing federal support for it, but can't be president forever. I was just going to bring us to the next guy. You ready for the next one? Okay. All right. Hey, I'm sure you know which one's next, right? Which one do you think out of these two?
JFK.
Yeah, JFK is going to be next. But as you probably know, Nixon will get there eventually. And so this is a picture from the first televised presidential debate between a Democratic candidate and a Republican. Now they like before this time, people would see pictures of their candidates. They could see them in person if they were lucky enough, or they would just hear them on the radio. But now, because television, like we talked about, had spread throughout 90% of Americans' homes, and everybody could watch these things, they're very interested in watching TV. There wasn't a lot of channels back then. If you're lucky, you had like 2 to 4 channels. So this, for a lot of people, this was probably the only thing on. And so Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, entered the 1960 presidential race running against Vice President Richard Nixon. So we've already introduced Nixon. Remember, he was a congressman out of California, and then he's going to be vice president under Eisenhower. Well, JFK, he's going to enter politics as well. He comes from a very wealthy family. His father was a pretty smart investor. During the Great Depression, um, he waited until a lot of businesses were essentially ruined from the Depression, and then he bought them at a super low price and waited things out. And when the economy turned around, these things were worth a lot of cash. So they became super rich from that, essentially from very patient investing, right? That's what they say. If you're going to invest, you got to look at the long run. If you try to, yeah, you got to look at the long term. You can't just sell when things dip, or you're just going to be not doing well. All right, so both candidates are in on very similar platforms. So, and that's how it was like back in the day. Like Democrats and Republicans weren't that different back then, unless it was like on a lot of policy issues, like taxes, education, foreign relations. Whereas you see a lot more divergence today. So much of what determined the outcome of the election was how the candidate appealed to voters. So its appearance, its confidence, stuff like that. This election featured the first televised debate between two presidential candidates. The many listeners who listened through the radio believed that Nixon won the debate. He was a better debater. Most voters had televisions, remember? And so the people who watched TV was like, Kennedy looked more, he looked more confident. He looked more youthful and healthy. Nixon was just getting over like the flu or something right before this. And Kennedy's people were smart. They knew that if you're going to go on TV, you're supposed to wear makeup, kind of keep the glare off so you don't look all sweaty and wet.
Yeah.
Nixon didn't know that. So he looked like this greasy, tired, sickly guy. And so even though he gave a better debate, people thought, they were like, oh gosh, look at him. He's going to die in a minute. So Kennedy was the one to go with. Those who viewed the debate via television were more impressed with JFK as he appeared more youthful and confident, while Nixon had overcome an illness and appeared to be disheveled. So, yeah. And so Nixon will come back, as you know, but we'll have to get to that after we start talking about the Vietnam War. So, and Kennedy's going to be the first, I think he's going to be the first non-Protestant president. So that means he's the first Catholic president in the White House, even though he was a Democrat, which we often think of back then as predominantly Southern, but there were Northern Democrats as well. So, and here is Eisenhower during Kennedy's presidential inauguration. That's where he swears himself in, says a little speech. Thank you for voting for me. There's his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. We'll talk about him later. And of course, there's Nixon. So, all right. Kennedy won the presidency by a narrow margin over Nixon, despite the vice president's executive experience. And it's kind of funny because he might have won narrowly, but he was still a very popular president after he entered office. As Kennedy entered the office at the age of 43, he called for Americans to consider, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So he's the youngest guy to ever become president. As JFK took office, the civil rights movement was intensifying as college students began sit-ins at local restaurants, like we talked about earlier, for service at restaurants that refused to serve African Americans. And these, of course, were like mixed races. They weren't only African Americans who were part of this movement, especially around the college towns and stuff like that. And that's something that, like, a lot of this was a younger generation movement. Because a lot of the older generations were just so set in their ways, I guess you could say, that they didn't see any reason or need for a change away from segregation. Sit-ins spread throughout 140 cities across the nation, so it caught on fire. Meanwhile, in 1961, a group of civil rights activists known as the Freedom Riders began to make a bus ride from Washington, D.C. to Alabama and Mississippi to protest segregation. So it's one of those funny things because you can have because segregation, like I told you, was based on local laws or local state laws. It wasn't like a national thing. And like military bases, for example. So like military bases that were in the north didn't have segregated bathrooms and buses and stuff like that. But military bases like in Georgia did. So you could be like a black soldier and you're like at Fort Drum, New York, and you don't really have to face much segregation. And then if you went down to like Fort Benning, Georgia, yeah, all of a sudden you would have to ride in the back of the bus, even on a military base, use separate restrooms and things like that. And so what they're doing is they're challenging that. They got a Greyhound bus and they decided, well, we're just going to all ride in the front of the bus or wherever we want to and ride across these southern states, despite the rules, as a form of protest. But as you can tell, it was met with resistance. So I think didn't the bus station in Tyler close down?
What?
Yeah, like the Greyhound station. Every time I drive by, it looks closed.
Oh, the great.
Yeah,
I thought there was something.
it's by the library, but like the last few times we drove by it, it looked closed, unless they moved it or something.
I'm not gonna lie, I have seen a lot of buses around it. I think transporting people to it's right here, Broadway.
I wonder what it'd be like to have a train station here. I don't know. I probably would never get on. All right. So civil rights in the Cold War is going to be our last one for today. We want to let you turn you loose on your study island. So as the Freedom Riders traveled on, they faced increased violence, especially when they reached Birmingham, Alabama. So they didn't make this a secret. They were doing this for the publicity. They were doing this to bring a spotlight on their message of, hey, Jim Crow laws aren't good. Segregation's bad. We're people too. In 1963, MLK and many others held protest marches in Birmingham, Alabama. This was like the center of it all at the beginning of the movement, only to be beaten and arrested by the authorities. And so they would spend time in jail. There's a famous letter from Martin Luther King Jr. written from a jailhouse of Birmingham, Alabama. Of course, we're going to find that in civil rights marches, we're going to turn fire hoses on people, which can really beat you up and knock you down to hurt you. Police dogs to bite people, all getting clubbed by hickory sticks. Cops used to have a lot more often than these days. And so it got pretty brutal. JFK sent 3,000 soldiers into Birmingham to keep order. So just like Eisenhower, he's going to use U.S. troops to try to calm things down. That same year, 1963, MLK and others organized the March on Washington of up to 250,000 people, the largest gathering in American history up to that point. We know there have been larger ones since then, but this was a really big deal back then. And he gave his very famous I Have a Dream speech. As the fight for civil rights carried on, the military and its budget expanded preparation for possible nuclear war. So you see that there's changes, but there's also a lot of disturbances within America. And at the same time, we're worried about a nuclear holocaust, a nuclear war with like the Soviets. And so this is a very anxious time for the country. Development on intercontinental ballistic missiles, known as ICBMs, led to the ability to launch nuclear weapons into orbit and on the other side of the world. So here we're using technology from the space race to be able to fire like nuclear missiles from one side of the world. They go up into orbit, undetectable, can't shoot them down. And then at a place of your choosing, they re-enter orbit and blow up over your intended target. So this is really scary. It could happen at any time with little warning. And so the nuclear war gets more and more deadly as far as the strength of the bombs, their undetectable nature, especially when we put them on submarines, because there's no way to detect nuclear submarines. You just can't do it unless you run over them. Can't even do it with satellites. So It's going to be a pretty scary time for a lot of people. And that's going to end our lecture for today. Please make sure you go to the U.S. History Spring 2021 Classroom tab and do the Study Island assignments. Make sure you do the old one first. See you later. Jalissa, what do you want?
A laptop.
For what?